A jagged canyon cut through the limestone ridge like a scar. Cold wind funneled through the narrow passage, carrying snowflakes and distant shouts. The sound of boots echoed off stone. A young woman was dragged from the dark mouth of a cave. Her hands were bound in front of her. Her dress was torn, her face bloodied, and her eyes wild with terror. She stumbled as 5 armed men surrounded her like wolves closing in. At the front, a man with a coiled rope stepped forward and spat into the dust. "She murdered my brother," he growled. "She'll hang before sundown." They marched her toward the canyon's mouth, where the land widened just enough for a hanging tree. But before they reached it, a voice cut through the wind. "No one's hangin' nobody not while I'm breathin'." A figure emerged from the mist, tall, limping, weathered. A long cavalry coat flapped at his legs. He leaned on a cane. A shotgun rested across his shoulder. His left eye was milky white, clouded and dead. It was Silas Rowan. They called him Blindside. Silas Rowan was a relic. Once a soldier, then a miner, now a ghost who haunted the hills. 58, half-blind, living alone on a dying ranch since his wife died of fever and his son was gunned down in a border raid. Some said he once killed 6 men in one night to defend his land. Others said he drank himself blind after he lost everything. No one knew the truth, and Silas never offered it. He hadn't stepped into a fight in years. Until now. The girl, bloodied, shaking, half-collapsed, looked up at him. Her name was Annalise Crow, 21, half Cherokee, half settler, raised by a healer and a railroad man who vanished in the war. Since her mother's death, Annalise had lived alone in the hills, slipping through caves and forests like a ghost. Folks whispered she was a witch, that she spoke to spirits or poisoned wells. Now they claimed she'd murdered Elias Monroe, a rancher known for drinking hard and riding harder, a man who once tried to pull her from a riverbank against her will. She'd been found near his body. No one asked what happened before the blade. They just saw a brown-skinned girl and a dead white man. Silas eyed the crowd. "Got proof?" he asked. Laughter answered him. Someone spat. "You want to swing with her, old man?" Silas shifted the shotgun off his shoulder. "Bring a rope for me too, if you're so sure." The canyon fell silent. Tulliver Monroe stepped forward, Elias's brother. Rope in one hand, pistol in the other. "You've lost your damn mind, Blindside." "Maybe," Silas said, "but I ain't lost my aim." A younger man lunged forward. Silas fired into the ground at his boots. The gun roared. Dust jumped. The man stumbled back, cursing. Annalise flinched. Her split lip trembled. Silas stepped between her and the mob, standing firm despite the limp. "A lot of noise from men who need a rope to feel powerful," he said. Then came the sound of hoofbeats. The sheriff arrived, young, barely 25, pale beneath the brim of his hat. 2 deputies followed. "What in God's name is going on here?" "Justice," Tulliver snapped. "This which killed my brother." "She'll be taken in," the sheriff said. "Proper trial." "Judge won't be here for a week," someone said. "She'll vanish by then." "She won't," Silas said. "I'll ride with her." "She don't deserve a horse." "She'll ride mine," Silas said. "I'll walk." The crowd grumbled. Tulliver stepped in close. "She ain't your fight." Silas leaned in. "Maybe not, but she's someone's daughter, and I buried mine long ago. That shut the canyon up." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Fine, but if she vanishes, it's on you." Silas turned to Annalise. Gently, he lifted her onto his horse. She winced in pain, but held firm. He handed her the reins. "Hold tight," he murmured. "Don't let him see you break." As they rode past the men who would have hanged her, Annalise kept her chin high. Silas muttered under his breath, "I seen too many graves filled with lies. Not this time." Snow began to fall. Together, they disappeared into the mist. and the canyon was quiet again. Mood, cold, tense, suspenseful, building bonds, threats, and mystery. The days passed like slow-moving cloud shadows across the prairie. Time softened around the small cabin, tucked between rustling cottonwoods and the murmur of the nearby creek. Maren rose before the sun, and now, so did the children. She taught them gently, not with lectures, but through action. Ruth, the smallest, was assigned to collect eggs, her tiny fingers reaching cautiously beneath fluffed feathers. Eli, still silent, helped her feed the goats, his solemn eyes always scanning the edges of the property. And Tessa, ever watchful, helped chop kindling and boil water for morning tea. Sometimes Maren would catch them glancing at her, uncertain but no longer afraid. One afternoon, as they gathered around the fire to eat, Ruth began to hum, a tuneless little song of her own invention. The sound froze Maren mid-stir, heart aching. It was the first music that had touched the cabin since John died. That same evening, as Maren helped Tessa mend a torn shawl, the girl finally spoke. "We ain't going back," she said, quiet but firm. Maren looked into those flint-gray eyes, full of something far older than a 9-year-old should carry, and nodded. "No, child," Maren whispered, brushing a lock of hair from Tessa's cheek. "You're not." They began sleeping inside soon after. All 3 children curled into one bed like kittens, blankets tangled and limbs overlapping. Tessa always slept on the edge, protector still. Maren stood by the mantel that night, staring at the faded photo of her husband, John Calloway, all dressed in wool and sunlight. Then slowly she took the frame down. In its place, she hung the burlap sacks, freshly washed, stitched with small colored threads by Ruth's fingers. They hung like ghosts no longer, but badges of survival. And in the silence that followed, something warm began to take root. The wind shifted overnight. The next morning, a low groan rolled across the valley, deepened slow like the growl of some great beast waking in the hills. By midday, the clouds boiled black, bloated with rain. The goats bleated nervously. The hens wouldn't leave the coop. Then the sky split. A thunder crack, so sharp it rattled the windows. Lightning snapped a tree clean in half, the old cottonwood near the barn. Maren flung open the door. "We need to move the stock, now." She barely had time to grab her slicker before racing into the gale. The wind clawed at her hair, driving rain sideways like buckshot. Tessa appeared behind her, soaked but steady. Eli followed, carrying a half-empty bucket. They threw open the barn doors just as another bolt struck the ridge. Inside, the horses kicked against the stalls. One slipped loose, eyes wild, and crashed past Maren, hooves skimming her hip. She fell hard onto the mud-slicked ground. Ruth screamed from the porch. Her tiny voice cracked through the thunder. The barn creaked, ready to come down. Tessa and Eli dragged Maren clear just as a beam snapped, crashing where her head had been. Together, they crawled back toward the house, drenched and heaving, pulling her body between them. Inside, Ruth sobbed and pulled blankets from the bed. Maren's eyes fluttered. Her lips were blue. And then darkness. The fire crackled softly. Rain still pattered against the windows, but inside the cabin, warmth returned. Maren's fever broke sometime before dawn. Her eyelids fluttered open, breath raspy, body weak. Shapes moved in her blurred vision. The children, sleeping near the hearth, curled up together like fawns. And then another figure, tall, silent, kneeling at her bedside. A hand pressed a damp cloth to her brow. The scent of smoke and earth lingered. She blinked. "Crow that walks." The man from the trees. No words were exchanged, just a quiet nod. He rose and tended the fire, stoking it higher. Outside, the chickens stirred. The goats brayed, fed. By the time the sun kissed the horizon, he was gone. But in the corner of the room, carved from soft pine, sat a small wooden bear with button eyes. Ruth would find it first. Later, a flint knife, sized perfectly for a child's hand, appeared on Eli's shelf. No one saw him leave either gift. But each time, the fire was higher, the traps reset, and the forest felt less like a threat, more like a sentinel. Trust, like the slow melt of spring snow, had begun. The sky had gone copper gray, the color it turns when something's coming. Maren moved through the cabin like a shadow, steady, quiet, resolved. She boarded the windows first, nailing old planks across the frames. Then she took the rifle from above the mantel and placed it into Eli's small hands. "This is how you load it," she said softly, showing him. "Don't point it unless you mean it." Eli nodded once, silent, but listening. Tessa already knew how. She'd watched enough to mimic the motions exactly, as if she'd been born with powder in her blood. Ruth helped where she could, digging shallow holes with her spoon, helping Maren bury jars of beans and dried meat beneath the old oak near the well. "Just in case," Maren said, brushing dirt from Ruth's cheek. Later, Crow That Walks appeared soundlessly at the tree line. He nodded once and walked the perimeter with Maren, pointing to where he had set traps. Trip wires hidden in sagebrush, a shallow pit covered with pine needles, and a narrow trench filled with oil and dry grass. "Light it if they come close," he said. "Smoke blinds. Fire breaks resolve." They stood in silence for a long while, the wind rustling the leaves. The air tasted like coming thunder. That night, by the fire, Maren finally told the children the truth. She had once been a mother before this, a stillbirth, a boy she'd never named. She hadn't spoken of him, not even to John. "I thought if I didn't say his name, it wouldn't hurt," she said. "But silence just buries pain. It doesn't kill it." Ruth sat in her lap. Tessa leaned against her shoulder. Eli rested his head on her knee. Maren held them all close, whispering stories, ones she remembered, and ones she made up, just to hear them laugh. Dawn came like a wound, hoofbeats on frost-hardened earth. 5 riders, torches burning like angry stars. Tulliver Monroe was at the front, teeth bared, shouting, "You've got one chance. Hand the kids over, or we burn it all." Maren stood in the doorway, rifle aimed. "You want fire?" she said. "Come take it." She fired first. The shot tore into the nearest rider's arm, sending him spinning off his horse. The others returned fire. Bullets punched into the cabin's siding. Eli knelt by the porch rail, hands shaking, and pulled the trigger. He missed, but the bullet screamed past Tulliver's head, making him duck. It was enough. In the trees, Crow That Walks moved like smoke. His arrows were silent and sudden. One rider fell without a sound, another screaming as an arrow buried into his chest. Tulliver howled and threw a torch into the barn. Within seconds, it caught, dry hay and old wood bursting into flame. The fire licked the sky. Inside the cabin, Ruth screamed. Maren grabbed her, wrapped her in a wet blanket, and sprinted through the smoke-choked yard. A bullet grazed her side. Hot pain sliced under her ribs, but she didn't stop. She reached the well and dropped with Ruth into the dirt, coughing. A rider broke through the side fence and charged toward Eli. Tessa screamed and ran, knife in hand. She flung herself at the rider and stabbed him in the thigh. He roared, backhanded her across the face. But the damage was done. He fell from the horse, stunned. Eli grabbed a rock and struck again and again until he stopped moving. Across the field, Tulliver took an arrow to the leg. He screamed, stumbled, and tried to fire, but his gun misfired. He limped back to his horse and galloped off, cursing. Within minutes, it was over. One man moaned behind the barn. Another didn't move. The others were gone, scattered like coals in the wind. The barn was a furnace, collapsing beam by beam. Smoke choked the air, but the cabin still stood. Maren collapsed by the well, blood soaking her side, her breath shallow. The children knelt beside her, weeping, shaking, holding her as the world burned around them. Crow that walks limped toward them, his arm bleeding. He knelt and handed Maren a medicine bundle, wrapped in hide, tied with crow feathers. She tried to speak, but he touched her forehead gently, then turned and walked toward the forest. No words, only a farewell. The fire smoldered through the night. By morning, the barn was gone. The house was scorched, but still whole. The goats had scattered. The hens returned one by one. Inside the cabin, Ruth found something new at her bedside. A tiny wooden rabbit, carved with a crooked smile. Eli discovered a small, curved knife tucked into his coat. Sharp, balanced, handmade. No one had seen him leave either gift. But somehow they knew. The traps were gone. The trail was clean. And the forest was still watching. Maren sat on the porch, her arm bandaged, ribs aching. She looked out at the blackened field, at the broken fences, at her children alive. Tessa now wore a piece of Maren's wedding dress tied around her wrist. It had been torn from the hem during the fight. Maren hadn't even noticed. Tessa had wrapped it herself, a badge of something neither of them could name. The storm had passed. Weeks later, they walked the trail to the mountain. Maren led them, wounded but strong, along the narrow pass above the tree line. Below, smoke still curled from the ruined barn. Ahead, nestled in the hills, sat a Lakota village. Distant, peaceful. It was time. I've held them this far, Maren said aloud, though no one asked. But they deserve a place where the world won't call them property. At the edge of the trail, she knelt by a wild rose bush. She pulled a photograph from her coat pocket. John Calloway, smiling faintly in his Union wool. She kissed the corner, then buried it deep beneath the roots. "You gave me strength," she whispered, "but they gave me life." She stood and took Tessa's hand. Eli walked beside them, holding a satchel of seeds. Ruth skipped ahead, humming a song of her own invention. Then Eli tugged at Maren's sleeve. He looked up, voice barely above wind. "Mama." Maren froze, her heart clenched. She looked down at him. Those quiet eyes, the dirt on his face, the weight of what he was really asking. She looked back once at the ranch, then forward, toward the mountain. "Yes," she said, and they walked on.